Hey y'all, and welcome back to Confederate Shop's YouTube channel. I have John White back with me, and before we begin, I'm just going to give a quick introduction on who he is. Jonathan White, PhD. His family has been in Virginia since 1622, so quite a long time. He's retired from the U.S. Army of 25 years of service. 22 of those years were in the Army Special Forces. You hold 4 master's degrees, and you received a PhD from the University of Alabama. You've been a teacher at the Virginia Military Institute and Liberty University. You're a published author, a historian, a husband, and a father. And again, thank you so much for joining me here.
My pleasure.
On the show. So on the last episode, we had talked about Fort Sumter, laid out really some of the details that many people are completely unaware of. Dismantled really the narrative, the modern narrative on it was all the South's fault. The South were the aggressors. The North were the good guys in the situation. We gave a lot of background information on that incident, and it led us to why would Lincoln want to perpetuate war against the South? And really, this comes down to economics, and it was really an economic question. And so it's going to take a little while to answer. It's not just a quick thing. So to begin there, why would Lincoln want to perpetuate war against the South?
Okay, before the war, in the FY 59 as an example, fiscal year 59, 95% of federal revenues come from tariffs, or taxes on imports. And so tariffs were a big part of where the federal government got all the money. The other part was land sales. They would sell land in the West. People would move out there. And so tariff policy is a big deal. Now, in the 1830s, the South Carolinians on the nullification crisis had said a tariff that's designed to protect industry is unconstitutional, whereas one to raise revenue is. So let me give you an example. This is a hypothetical. If you were to put a 100% tariff on insulin today, the users of the insulin would pay the tariff. I'll give you another example. If you put a $1 trillion tariff on cars imported from Japan, how much money would the federal government raise on that? It would be zero, because nobody's going to buy a Japanese car for $1 trillion, $20,000. So that would be a protective tariff, not a revenue tariff. If you put a 5%, 10% tariff on cars, now a $20,000 car costs $22,000. So it's a little more reasonable. Well, the South said, South Carolina in the 1830s had said, a protective tariff is unconstitutional because it's not designed to raise money, but a revenue tariff, which is a lower rate, is constitutional. So anyway, there was a debate on that. And in 1860, there was a bill that was proposed by Justin Morrill, who was a Republican from New England, to raise tariff rates, and it did not pass, but it was on the table in the 1860s. It was on the table for when the presidential election happened. And Buchanan, who's from Pennsylvania, had won the state of Pennsylvania, and tariffs became a big issue by 1860. So when all this Deep South seceded from South Carolina over to Texas, and they withdrew their representatives in Congress, probably should have stayed in hindsight, until the Union recognized their independence, but that's neither here nor there. But when they withdrew, the Republicans go, okay, let's pass that bill. And so they did. And Buchanan signed it. Buchanan is a Northern Democrat, not Abraham Lincoln. Buchanan signed it. But the Morrill tariff went into effect on the 1st of April, and it greatly increased tariff rates. The Confederate Constitution, or the Confederate Constitutional Convention, had adopted the U.S. tariff rate, 1857 tariffs, and then, for example, Louisiana allowed free transit of the Mississippi River, and then the Confederate Congress adopted a free transit of Confederate territory overall, duty-free transit overall, so that any shipper that wanted to ship goods to, say, Richmond, which was in the Union at that time, in say, March 1861, they could land it in Charleston, pay no tariff whatsoever, transship it to Richmond, and because the U.S. tariff laws were you can't tax a good that's coming from Charleston to Richmond, because according to the Union position, South Carolina is in the Union.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were caught on this economic dilemma. So, and lest people say, well, no, nobody was actually doing that. Well, let me tell you. This is from a St. Louis newspaper in March 26, 1861. So this is right about the time when the Morrill tariff is about to go into effect, but after the duty-free transit law, duty-free transit of Confederate territory has gone into effect. This is what they said. Every day, importers of foreign merchandise are receiving by way of New Orleans, in the Confederacy, very considerable quantities of goods duty-free. The goods are landed at the port of New Orleans. No customs house notice is taken of them. No bonds are executed for the payment of the duties on their arrival there. And on many articles, the saving of 1/2 of the duty only would afford a handsome profit. If this thing is to become permanent, there will be an entire revolution of the course of trade. New York will suffer terribly. Our merchants have their capital up to justify them making their purchases in Europe and shipping to New Orleans. And in that city, because the difference of the tariff, goods can be bought cheaper than in New York. So this is a newspaper in the United States at the time. So there's more. This is from the New York Times on April 2nd, so the day after the Morrill tariff went into effect. The New York Times reported from Charleston that, this is a quote, 4 agents from Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield, and Birmingham will be here by the 1st of April to make arrangements for direct trade with Great Britain. So before the tariff, this tariff change had happened, about 95% of the tariff revenues had been collected in New York because it had a good port, it had railroads, it had banks. It was just sort of the nexus. And if you can lend your goods anywhere, may as well lend them in New York. They got warehouses and railroads and coastal shipping and banking, et cetera, landed there. Well, this change in the tariff laws was going to make New York no longer the center of business. It was going to be really bad for New York businesses. This is Thomas Clingman, a North Carolina congressman or senator, on March 19th, 1861. So 12 days before the Morrill tariff went into effect. Merchants from my own state go down to Charleston and lay in their goods. This government, as things now stand, is not going to get any revenue from them. If goods are imported at Charleston at 10 or 15 or 19% duty, whatever is paid will go to the coffers of the Confederate states. And merchants will go down from my state, North Carolina, and buy their goods there, and thus you lose a great portion of the North Carolina trade. It will be the same for Tennessee. And Tennessee, it will be the same for Mississippi Valley. If you, pardon me, my eyesight's bad. If you have no customs house between Louisiana and the upper Mississippi, merchants up there will go down and buy their goods in New Orleans. If they learn that at New York they can buy goods under a tariff of 50 or 75%, and that they can buy them at New Orleans under a tariff of only 1/3 that, they will go down to New Orleans, and the result will be that we shall get very little revenue under the existing system. So this differential between duty-free transit across Confederate territory and a really high tariff in New York meant that business was no longer going to be going through New York.
They were a serious threat.
And they knew that.
The seceded states were a serious threat to Northern industry.
And Philip Foner, who's the uncle of Eric Foner, who's at Columbia, wrote a book in the 30s about New York City businessmen and Lincoln. And he said that an entourage of New York City businessmen went down to Washington in late March 1861, met with President Lincoln and said, "You have got to do something. We are going to lose our shirts. If nobody is shipping through New York, we're going to suffer economically. And you're not going to get any tariff revenues." And so within a week of that meeting, President Lincoln decided to launch the military expedition to Fort Sumter.
Yeah, there are a couple historical quotes too that you had mentioned to me. I knew one from a while back. It was I believe it was the It was John. Was it John Baldwin?
John Balwin.
John Baldwin, and that was a pretty well sourced quote. I mean, the history on that's pretty solid. But there were also two other quotes too.
Good point.
Yeah, could you talk about those or bring
Sure
those
thing.
up? If people have never heard this is history gold in my opinion.
Okay. John B. Baldwin was a Unionist. He was from Stanton, Virginia, which is just down the road, and he was one of the guys politicking in the Virginia Convention to stay in the Union. And President Lincoln sent a message to the head Unionist in the Virginia Convention and said, "Come see me." And he said, "I can't leave right now." So he sent John Baldwin, who was his deputy. And so he said, and this was in April 4th, I think. They had a meeting with Lincoln, and this Virginia at the time was trying to construct a compromise that would bring the seceded states back into the Union and satisfy the North and the South, keep the Union together. But to do that, fighting could not break out. If somebody fired a shot, then it was not going to work, and we're going to have a civil war. So Baldwin says, "Tell you what, Mr. Lincoln, why don't you just evacuate Fort Sumter? Just let it go. Who cares? You can order the military forces there to leave, and that way shooting will not break out, and then we can continue to build this compromise that'll bring the seceded states back." And President Lincoln said this, well, this is a quote now, this is word for word. "Well, what about the revenue? What would I do for the collection of duties?" Because if he does that, he ain't collecting nothing. And all this commerce is going to flow through Charleston or other southern ports. Okay, and then the next one was this guy, Alexander Hugh Holmes Stewart, who's also from Stanton. He was another Virginia Unionist, and he had an office call with President Lincoln, and he and two other Virginia delegates went to see President Lincoln on April 12th. And so Stewart suggested that Lincoln evacuate the forts, to which Lincoln responded, "If I do that, what will become of my revenue? I might as well shut up housekeeping at once." Now, people hear these two and they go, well, these are Southerners, and oh, by the way, most of the tariffs weren't collected in the South anyway, so this is balderdash. It doesn't make any sense. But no, it was the tariff differential that existed in early April of 1861, which meant that a lot of commerce, maybe most of the commerce, was going to be shipped through southern ports, and New York businessmen especially were going to lose their shirts. And there's one more, if you don't mind me.
Oh yeah, please.
On April 22nd, very few people have heard of this one, and I'm happy to have this on YouTube. A delegation, this is April 22nd, so after the firing on Fort Sumter, remember, nobody died in the firing on Fort Sumter. The guys had been allowed to surrender and go away. But a delegation from the YMCA came to see Lincoln. And a Reverend Richard Fuller, who owned a plantation on the Sea Island of Georgia, but he lived in Baltimore. He was living in Baltimore. He's a sort of an absentee planter. But he's a reverend, and he worked at the YMCA. So he went to see Lincoln. He says, well, why don't you just recognize the independence of the South? And then this whole thing will go away. And Lincoln said, what is to become of the revenue? I shall have no government, no resources. And that was printed in the Baltimore Sun, 23rd of April, 1861, page 2, column 1, if you're looking for it. So these are three different sources that were of men that most of them were Unionists that went to see President Lincoln in April 1861 and said, just evacuate the fort. And three different times, three different occasions, President Lincoln said, no, I can't. What about the revenue? Right. And so the people that poo-poo that say, most of the revenue is collected in New York. They were the ones paying the tariff. Well, no, the purchases were, but the final purchases, they were just collected in New York. There's a difference. And the other thing was that President Lincoln knew very well that peace was an utter catastrophe for New York businessmen.
Man, you nailed it. Like I said, but all three of those quotes are history gold, and I think that really sums up the answer for why Lincoln wanted to perpetuate war, why he couldn't simply let the South go because of money. There you have it, folks. And I will put all these resources in the bottom of this episode in the description. So anybody that has questions about the citations, the sources, they can look down there in the description. But do you have anything else you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, in closing, I would just say this: when the modern day, the neo-abolitionists or modern day Unionists, if you bring up anything other than slavery, they get really testy. But on 3 different occasions, President Lincoln, who made the decision to send an armed expedition to Charleston, 3 different occasions, the first words out of his mouth were, "What about the revenue? What about the tariff?" And so we have to understand the economic situation as it existed in April of 1861 to understand why the actors acted the way they did. And so I'm hoping that this will help shed some light for your viewers.
Well said, sir. Well said, and thank you so much for coming on this our YouTube channel here on ConfederateShop.com. If you folks like Dr. White's stuff, you can actually read a lot of his essays and articles on the Abbeville Institute's website. The Abbeville Institute is a fantastic, phenomenal resource for preserving this Southern history. They also have a wonderful book publisher, the Shotwell Press. That's where many of my books actually come from. So you can find him on there. And again, I thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Happy to oblige.